Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Prita Bhattacharya, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we'll talk about social and cultural history of India, and our special focus is on the position of women in early India. As you know, from the beginning of times, the society has progressed through the joint labor of men and women. Today, we are going to discuss the roles of various categories of women in different arenas of life, in the domestic sphere as well as in other productive activities. The objective of this module is to trace the evolution of patriarchy in early India and the specific roles played by various categories of women in the process of production and reproduction. As we know, there is very scanty evidence from the earliest period. For the earliest period, we have to rely entirely on archaeological evidence. Apart from the skeletal remains, we have the early cave paintings, especially from Madhya Desa or the various caves of Madhya Pradesh. The first cave paintings have been recovered from Bhimbetka. It has been argued that women were engaged in gathering fruit and other wild produce and hunting small game using basket and small nets. So you see that there was no rigid sexual division between men and women as far as the process of production was concerned. As we move on to the Mesolithic period, we encounter the same trends. It is very likely that women participated in the hunt, apart from undertaking all-important part in gathering, which in any case accounted for the major source of food in tropical climates. In this context, we see the evolution of a distinctive ritualistic practice, namely the origin of mother goddess worship. The cave paintings show pregnant women, women in their nurturing role as mothers, and women in the act of childbirth. All these three imageries of women have been associated with the figure of a mother goddess. It has also been argued that the first form of religious expression for men and women was the psychological bond between mother and child. The mother was considered as the giver of life as well as the goddess of death. Prehistoric paintings at various places like Kathotia, Bhimbetka and Karwai treat female sexuality as one aspect of female existence. Then it was not distinguished from the act of giving birth. Thus, women as producers are as important as women as mothers, as reproductive. The reproductive roles of women are as important as their productive roles in the hunting-gathering economy. As we move on to the Harappan society, we see the continuation of this kind of mother goddess worship. It is clearly evident from the wide range of terracotta figurines that we get from the Harappan sites. However, the Harappan society has advanced to a class society, and it is evident that the subjugation of women was already underway, and it has been suggested that some form of community or clan control over women and their sexuality was an aspect of social organization in the archaic states like Harappa. The problem is that the mother goddess figurines symbolize the ritualization of the productive roles of women, while on the real plane, in real life, the value of the woman was being depreciated constantly. As we move on to Vedic society, we enter a completely new phase as far as the role of women was concerned. Here we encounter a purely patriarchal, pastoral society. It was also a militaristic society with constant clashes between various tribes and segments of tribes. So, human resource and the desire for progeny was the most prominent aspect of this society. So, the reproductive role of the woman and the woman as the mother of male children had become all important in the Vedic society. In the early parts of the Rig Veda, we find women enjoying a measure of freedom, apparently. This was to be expected amongst a pastoral, nomadic people. Society's attitude to the woman is betrayed, however, in the various imageries, like the imagery of Ushas or Dawn, who is a beautiful goddess, but at the same time, she has also been singled out as a shameless woman. But there are other imageries, like the image of the unmarried woman who had the freedom to choose her own partner. The Rig Veda even records women fighters who took part in battles. As far as education was concerned, it is of primary importance that the Rig Veda contains several hymns composed by 27 women seers, and we have their names in the Rig Veda. However, within the first few decades of Aryan settlement, women began to lose their right of studying the sacred lore. They were being ousted from the ritualistic space. They were not being allowed to take part in the important rituals. This phenomenon came about when the Aryans began to interact with the non-Aryan indigenous population and began to take non-Aryan wives. That is an important point in history. While society withdrew women's right to initiation and her right to study the sacred texts. Later, however, in the grammatical texts, we still find the feminine suffix, which distinguishes a woman teacher from a teacher's wife. This is, of course, in a later period. In the Vedic society, after the Indo-Aryans had settled down on the Indian soil, the woman was steadily beginning to lose her freedom along with most of her rights as an individual. As time progressed, she lost access to wealth, and even she lost the right to regulate her own body. Her life was divided into two parts. The early years were spent at her father's house, and after puberty she was given in marriage and passed the rest of her life at her in-laws' house. However, marriage was not as obligatory in the Vedic period as it later became. Another important aspect was the problem of widowhood. This became a glaring problem as time progressed, but in the Rig Vedic age, we are certain that the widows probably lived on after their husband's death, and sometimes they were marrying their younger brothers-in-law, because it all stems from this desire for the male progeny, and the productive woman could not be ousted from this reproductive function. The background of the text suggests that the practice of self-immolation of the widow was known. It is just a hint. We don't have any concrete evidence, but it may have been practiced at certain pockets. Polyandry, this was a custom that was not entirely unknown. We have evidence from the Atharva Veda which says that when a woman takes a second husband, she has to perform certain special rituals. The text yield alternative meanings of widows remarrying, but in either case, whether polyandry or widow remarriage, the passage signify rights that the woman later lost completely. Organized prostitution was probably not known in the Rigvedic period, but here we have certain terms which could signify women who would cater to several men. The terms are Hasra, Agru, Rajayatri, Apaskadvari, etc. Later, of course, in the later Vedic period and still later, the terms would multiply and there would be a kind of gradation in the system, and rights, obligations and social positions became stratified even more clearly. Polygamy was a common practice in the Vedic society. There is an extremely revealing passage which says that is prosperity when a man's wives are fewer than his cattle. So a man's wife and cattle, they were uttered on the same breath and they were counted as items of property. The Moitrayani Samhita mentions the 10 wives of Manu. The Taittiriya Samhita narrates how the Mun, a husband of 27 wives, was punished because he loved Rohini best. As we move on to the early historical period, we see further changes, further structural changes within the society, and new kinds of sources, mostly written sources, were being available from this period. We have a wide range of sources. Firstly, we have the Buddhist texts which were being composed from let's say 3rd century BCE. The Arthashastra, the earliest part of the Arthashastra can be placed in the 3rd century BCE, but of course it took its final shape at a much later date. Then we have the prescriptive texts like the early Dharma Sutra literature. Then we have the classic text, the classic Smriti text of Manu, which clearly delineated the standards of gender relationships within the society. Then we have the Kama Sutra, which could be placed in the Gupta period, and here we have different categories of women who were expected to provide sexual services, and we have a wide range of women who could be coaxed to give sexual services. In the early historical period, as we look at the general picture, we can assume that the girl child was gradually becoming unwanted because the women who gave birth to girl children were sought to be punished. Another model that we encounter in the early historical period is the model of the Pativrata, the woman who was required to submerge her personality entirely in her husband's. We have a very interesting quotation from Jaggobalko. Jaggobalko says that when a wife refuses to satisfy her husband, then he should first try to placate her with soft words, then try to shower her with gifts, and if she still refuses, he should thrash her with his bare hands or with a stick and force her into subjugation. So this is the attitude towards women in the early historical period. As for material resources, we see that women were gradually being on the margins of the processes of social production, so their access to wealth was becoming more and more limited. Textual traditions, which are generated by the urban elite, suggest that women were to be confined to the domestic sphere. At the same time, from the literary texts and a part of the Buddhist corpus, we have evidence that women were working outdoors. They were doing all kinds of work. But these are, of course, not mentioned in the prescriptive texts because the prescriptive texts were projecting an ideal situation. In the Manusmriti, we find that the legitimate means of acquiring resources open to women were amazingly few. These were effectively confined to gifts made by kinsmen. But these gifts were all movable gifts. These gifts did not include land, and for that matter, did not include cattle, which were the primary items of wealth in the early historical period. But the archaeological sources, mostly epigraphic, do not agree with the picture provided by the prescriptive texts. We have votive inscriptions which indicate that at least from 2nd century BCE, women were making constant donations to a variety of religious institutions. Mostly these grants were made to Buddhist Jain institutions, but also we have references to women who were giving gifts to Brahminical institutions. It is possible to argue that women who were supporting heterodox traditions like Buddhism or Jainism were probably in a position to exercise greater control over resources than those women who were located within a more overtly Brahminical context. The other kind of women that we come across, especially in the early medieval period and particularly within the context of South India, but also we have some references to North India, are the temple women who would be associated with large institutions which stored vast amounts of resources, vast amount of money. A distinct category of women, particularly in South India, were known as Tevaratiyar or temple women. The inscriptions of the Tevaratiyar, however, do not contain the prashasti or eulogy which indicate that even the temple women's access to the domains of ritual and political power were limited. Also, we have evidence from inscriptions that women were excluded from prestigious ritual roles, including that of priest. Women could never become priests, and the drummer. Another category of women who could have access to wealth by their own agency are the courtesans, who reference to the courtesans are come a plenty from the early historical sources as well as from the early medieval sources. But we must keep in mind that though some of these women accrued a lot of money, it could not be translated into social status. The prostitutes were abhorred in society, and the Arthashastra, which is a primary text which deals with the household of the Ganika, reports that the house of the Ganika was under close supervision. There was a category of prostitutes who paid taxes to the state, and the state in return was bound to protect these women from abuses and swindlers. In literary Sanskrit texts such as Mrichakatika, which is a Sanskrit play composed in the transitional phase between the early historic and early medieval period, portrays the life of the Ganika within the background of flourishing urbanism. But we must keep in mind that all the Ganikas, all the prostitutes were not wealthy, though they were earning their own money. The affluent Ganika of the big towns, of course, lived in luxury, but most of these women consisted of slave girls, destitute women, and kumbhadasis who had been mentioned in the Buddhist texts. And these women had no control whatsoever over their own body and their own labor. We have atypical references from certain narrative texts which show women working outside the domestic sphere as well as within the domestic sphere. We have the Jatakas from North India and the Sangam literature from South India. These texts have documented the presence of women in a wide range of occupations. They worked as agricultural laborers, they worked in the fields, they were stock breeders, and there were those who were engaged in a variety of crafts, including basket making, weaving, and in some instances also in pottery. Now we come to a most crucial part in the discussion. We must clarify the relationship between the reproductive functions of women and the question, the problem of women's sexuality. During the early historic period, and of course well into the early medieval period, we have textual evidence which sort of puts a barrier between the reproductive functions of the woman and the question of women's sexuality. From this period, women's sexuality began to be channelized into more legitimate domains like reproductive functions, like giving birth, like being a mother and wife. According to one text, women have been sinful right from the beginning, when the Creator first made the 5 gross elements. Here you see a discussion is being initiated about the true nature of the woman, the Stri Swabhava. Women are being compared with the edge of a razor, with poison, with snakes and fire, all rolled into one. At the time of creation, the original Manu allocated to women the habit of living, sitting around, gossiping, an indiscriminate love of ornaments, treachery, meanness, bad conduct, and so on and so forth. This has been going on from a long time. The Shatapatha Brahmana, which is a very early text, tells a story and recounts that a woman, a Shudra, a dog, and the crow are the embodiments of untruth, sin, and darkness. The Buddhist Sangha began to induct women from an early period, but still the Sangha and the early Buddhist texts express a kind of misogyny as far as the innate nature of women was concerned. A Jataka story states that a woman are a sex composed of wickedness and guile. Womankind holds truth for falsehood and falsehood for truth. They are fickle, unstable as the sand, and as cruel as the snake. The Ramayana continues in the same vein, where Kaushalya, who is a woman herself, discusses the true nature of women. She says that women do not care for a good family, good deeds, or wisdom, and their hearts are ever inconstant. In the same text, Agastya states that it has been the woman's nature ever since creation to cling to a man when he prospers and to desert him in difficulty. In the prescriptive texts, these discussions about a woman's true nature comes out in far glaring pictures. According to Trambaka's version of Manu's Stripung Dharma, women are innately promiscuous, fickle-minded, lacking in life, and unfaithful to their husbands even when they are closely guarded. The Mahabharata says the same thing. It says that the women are difficult to control and they're always up to some trick or other. So now we come to some theoretical discussions about the links between patriarchy, which had developed and taken root from the early historical period, and the class structure, which is based on the notion of private property and which also started to develop from the early historic period. So we can discern some kind of collusion between these two hegemonic institutions, the institution of class and the institution of patriarchy. So we have seen that the early historical texts and in the early medieval period also, the texts speak about the innate nature of women. And there was this deep anxiety that because of this innate nature, women were to be controlled, they were to be protected, and this this thought has surfaced again and again in all the texts that we encounter. This projection of the fear of women's uncontrolled sexuality was the backdrop to the obsession with creating an effective system of control and the need to gird them constantly. It has been said in the early Dharma Sutra texts that a woman is protected by her father in her childhood. When she becomes married, she is protected by her husband, and when she gets old, she has to be protected by her son. So a woman can never be entirely free. She can never be on her own. When the controls are relaxed or cannot be effectively mounted, women's inordinate sexual lust will lead them to adulterous liaisons. A striking aspect of the obsessive need for control over women in the narrative literature of the Buddhists is that it has a close link with women of the upper strata, particularly within the royal courts and the Brahmana households, and occasionally within the household of the Gahapatis. We see that the women were cunning and evil and were always plotting against their husbands. Here we see that class is closely linked to the status of women, where the need to protect upper class and upper caste women is being foregrounded in the Buddhist texts. In the Buddhist literature, only two functions are associated with kingship: punishing those who commit crimes against the family, that is, the adulterers, and those who commit crimes against property, that is, robbers. So, the woman who transgresses has to be controlled by the family, and when the family fails, the state has to step in. The king has to punish the woman. This has been going on, this trend has been going on for a pretty long time. An ancient record in the Vinaya Pitaka describes how a woman who had committed adultery fled from her husband because her clan had authorized her husband to kill the woman, and she sought shelter in the Buddhist Sangha to escape punishment. After the emergence of the state, the Brahminical normative literature and the semi-secular Arthashastra laid down punishments for violence of the sexual code, which the king was expected to enforce. But there is also a deep concern about the maintenance of the hierarchical social order based on caste, which must be reproduced without diluting the purity principle. So, patriarchy was not only working in collusion with the class structure and the state, it was also working in collusion with the Varna system, the system of fourfold Varna. So Manu states this explicitly while discussing adultery. According to him, by adultery is caused the mixture of castes among men. Hence follows sin, which cuts up even the roots and causes the destruction of everything. So women who dally with several men who do not belong to her own caste brings about misfortune for the entire social order by giving birth to children who could not be placed within the social format of the fourfold Varnas. To sum up, we can see certain trends which had been on the rise ever since the institutions of private property, state, class and caste began to take root from the early historical period. It was the recognition that men were dependent upon women to perpetuate the social and moral order of their making that led them to confront the problem of women's sexuality. Because reproductive power was the one power that women still held in the new structure of relations in which they were subordinated. And one way of dealing with it was to simultaneously exaggerate and treat women's innate nature as terribly dangerous. Their uncontrolled sexuality was perceived as posing a threat, and the narrative and normative literature of ancient India is full of reference to the wickedness of women and to their insatiable lust. Today we have gone through an evolutionary sketch of the roles played by various categories of women within the home, within the domestic sphere and outside home in various productive activities. For further information on this subject, you can visit EPG Pathshala. Thank you.